Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Rotem and today we'll talk about tactus and proportions around 1600. Tactus and proportions are one of the infamously controversial issues in the theory of music between the 15th and 17th centuries. As much as the available sources are varied in their opinions, such is also the modern research of it. In this episode, we will limit ourselves to the period around 1600 and try to see what we can say about tactus and the often not so straightforward transitions between duple and triple meters. Let's start. Tactus, or battuta, is a unit of time, or beat, that is expressed with a physical movement, typically of the hand. The movement has two parts. First, a stroke downwards towards the beginning of the tactus, and then a stroke upwards during the tactus. When the tactus is in a duple meter, or tactus equalis, the upwards movement occurs in the middle of the tactus, like this. 1, 2, 1, 2. But when the tactus is in a triple meter, tactus inequalis, the upwards movement occurs on the third part of the tactus, like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This movement was a critical means of synchronizing the singing of different voices together. For those who have forgotten, in earlier times music was performed from separate parts, and never from a score where you can visually follow the other voices. If you don't count well, you can very quickly get lost and the music falls apart. Physically beating the tactus is something people actually did while singing, and it is evident in countless historical depictions of music making. Check the tactus category in the Early Music Sources iconography database. Some writers suggested that a tactus is an absolute unit, even connected to the human pulse. But these are probably Renaissance humanistic attempts to relate music to physiology, and should perhaps not be taken literally. Now, there are two ways to notate duple meters in the 16th century. C, which is nowadays called common time, and cazzi, which is nowadays, and also back then sometimes, was called alla breve. Originally, the slash through the C was a way to double the speed of this meter in comparison to a normal C. Note values on C would be equivalent to half the values in cazzi, as if the time were twice as fast. We will perhaps explain more about that in an episode about mensural notation, but for now, let's go back to the tactus. So, in C, called also alla semibreve, the tactus is on the semibreve, that is, the strokes are on the level of the minim, and with every 2 minims a tactus cycle is completed, like this. Tac, tus, tac, tus. In cazzi, alla breve, the tactus is on the breve, and the strokes are on the level of the semibreve, like this. Tac, tus, tac, tus. This is of course the theory. In practice, you will find that the signs cannot be your absolute guide. There is evidence that performers sometimes use a tactus other than the theoretical one, namely that they sometimes use the semibreve as a tactus in cazzi, and this had quite an effect on the performance. In modern terms, the beating of the different tactus might be equivalent to when a musician is asked to think in 2 instead of 4, or vice versa. But the decision of which tactus to use has even greater consequences when triple meters are involved. More about that soon. After the turn of the 17th century, some theorists, generalizing of course, connected the cazzi meter with its relatively big note values to the motet style, and the C meter with its relatively small note values to the madrigal style. This was also called sometimes note nere, black notes, as many notes were smaller than a minim and therefore literally black. As the cazzi is theoretically performed twice as fast as C, Some sources discussed the difference between the two meters in terms of faster and slower. But since the 2 meters were often used inconsistently across the repertoire, Praetorius suggested that the speed should be chosen according to the text and harmony, and not according to the signs. Also, Zacconi stated in that context that the speed of the tactus should anyway be chosen independently, according to the place, time, and occasion. To be sure then, the difference between pieces written in C and Cazzi is mainly graphical. A piece could sound just the same in this or the other meter. One final remark. It is implied that the tactus is solid and never changing. But Vicentino, for example, says, at least in the case of secular madrigals, that the beat should change according to the words, now slower and now faster, as this will gratify the listeners more than a persistent, changeless beat. Now that we know the basics of tactus and duple meters, let's see what we can say about triple meters and proportions without getting too confused. The most common triple meter proportion is the so-called sesquialtera, 3:2, 3 notes in the place of 2 notes of the same value. It is often portrayed with a symbol of the number 3 above the number 2, or with just a 3. The term tripla is sometimes assigned to another proportion of 3:1, 3 notes in the time of 1 note of the same value, but sometimes also used to describe sesquialtera, or generically a division of the tactus into 3. This little confusion is just the tip of the iceberg when dealing with triple meters and their proportions to duple meters. Let's have a closer look at the sesquialtera. If a piece starts in Cazzi, alla breve, and then a change is made to sesquialtera, instead of 2 semi-breves that comprise the breve tactus, we'll now have 3. This is called by some sources sesquialtera maggiore, and confusingly by other sources tripla, although the proportion is of 3:2 and not 3:1. Here is a generic example. Ta 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 ra ra ta 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 ra ra ta ta. Notice that even in a slightly faster tempo, the sesquialtera will almost always sound quite majestic and held back, allowing each of the 3 parts of the tactus to be clearly counted. Regarding the notation, if this example were to be notated in the manner of modern editions, there would be bar lines. The way to express this transition would be then to say that 1 bar of the duple meter is equal to 1 bar of the triple meter, and that a breve is equal to a dotted breve. Now, if we start in C, alla semibreve, and then a change is made to sesquialtera, instead of 2 minims that comprise the semi-breve tactus, we'll now have 3 minims. This is often called sesquialtera minore, like this. I won't sing it because it sounds just the same as the former example. Another way of notating sesquialtera, according to the sources, is by blackening the notes. This is often called emiolia, maggiore and minore respectively. The emiolia does not require a sign, so it's possible to integrate it for short moments within the composition. Some writers have concluded that the 4 ways to notate sesquialtera, maggiore, minore, and emiolia maggiore and minore, are different representations of the very same thing from the point of view of the listener. They all sound the same. The different interpretations of the tactus value can lead to quite different results when the triple section arrives. For example, if in alla breve we were to beat the semi-breve as a tactus, as is reported to be the case sometimes, although it's theoretically wrong, in the triple meter we will subdivide our quicker tactus. The result will be that the triple meter section is twice as fast. This is in fact a true tripla proportion, 3 notes in the time of 1 note of the same value. Let's listen to how such a reading sounds. Ta 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 ra ra ta 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 di ra ran da ra ta ta ta. As you heard, this tripla proportion does not sound as held back as the sesquialtera. It feels fast and can be easily counted as one unit. This interpretation is in fact a common mistake, which according to some sources, as well as some instrumental intabulations of pieces, was also a common mistake at that time. This mistake slowly became a sufficiently common practice, to the degree that it's not possible to know what the composers originally meant. This detail concerning which tactus should be used is one of the causes for confusion and uncertainty when dealing with proportions around 1600, a confusion that is shared with the musicians from that time. Theoretically, the meter sign, or time signature in modern terms, could have guided us to the way the composer meant us to interpret the proportion. In practice, this is unfortunately not the case, to say the least. Praetorius seemed almost angry when discussing this problem, showed these signs, and wrote that all of them, although used by the most famous composers of his time, must be removed and destroyed entirely. These signatures demonstrate nothing and are not absolutely necessary and useful, but on the contrary, produce only difficult intricacies. We won't go into what Praetorius suggested instead, but the general idea is clear. There was a great deal of confusion and uncertainty in how the signs should be interpreted, and it was not possible to rely on them when looking for the correct interpretation the composer was expecting. In some cases, composers used several meters simultaneously. In such cases, there is only one correct interpretation in which the parts are aligned. This might teach us about other cases, at least for other pieces by the same composer. Unfortunately, though, such cases are quite rare. So, due to the inconsistent theory, signs, and practice, we cannot know with certainty how to interpret triple meter sections. In many cases, however, the tactus can be identified and assumed musically, not scientifically, and then the triple sections are mostly the tactus divided by 3. If the obvious solution sounds weird or feels wrong, one can try to divide half the tactus into 3, or double the tactus into 3. You might end up with a satisfying result that might also have been historical. But must all possible solutions stem from a mathematical division? In some cases, and according to some sources, it seems that the answer is no. Let's see. This is a rather debated point among scholars, but there seem to be hints within some sources that imply that there is not necessarily a direct correlation between duple and triple meters. For example, Joachim Burmeister in 1601 describes which tempo should be taken in duple and in triple meters, but it does not imply that there is any relation between the two. Concerning the Emiolia which we mentioned before, while some theorists regarded it as another way of notating sesquialtera, some others suggested that the Emiolia is slightly faster. This concept of faster or slower by an unspecified amount breaks away from the concept of proportions and brings us closer to what we would categorize as a rather modern approach, where a steady tactus is not kept throughout a piece, and different sections get their own individual tempi. Girolamo Frescobaldi, in the preface to his Capricci from 1624, wrote about the interpretation of the different triple meter sections in his pieces. That's a great thing. What could be better than a guide from the composer himself for this confusing topic? Well, don't be too happy. What he wrote can be summarized in this manner. Funnily enough, modern scholars can take this evidence in two extreme directions. One, to say that this is a proof for a rather subjective and unprecise attitude towards the proportions. And another, to see it as the final result of a very specific system of proportions. This text by Frescobaldi led to several different modern proportion theories, including some quite complicated ones, but none of them gained wide acceptance. But theoretical sources are not everything. We can learn a lot, or in this case, we can get confused even more when looking at musical sources. Here is an excerpt from the canto part of the motet O Quam Suavis, for two voices and basso continuo by Lodovico Viadana from 1602. We are now interested to know how should we perform the transition from the triple meter to the duple meter that follows. The piece starts with a duple meter of Alla Breve. So theoretically, we should take the breve as our tactus, and then in the triple meter divide it by 3. As we hinted before and also demonstrated, towards the end of the 16th century things get a bit less strict. So one might take the semi-breve as tactus, divide this tactus by 3 and end up with a quicker 3. But in fact, it doesn't matter which kind of 3 we decide to have here, as in this case there is something else that might sabotage our search for the tactus. Let's look at the music. The phrase fastidiosus divites repeats 3 times. Fastidiosus divites, fastidiosus divites, fastidiosus Wait, what? When it comes the 3rd time, the meter changes in the middle of the musical phrase. It would be very weird to sing these notes suddenly faster or slower than they were already sung before. If we think that musically it would make sense to have these repeated notes sung in the same speed they were already sung, it means that one minima of the triple section will be equal to one chroma, 8th note in modern terms, of the duple section. Let's listen. Fastidiosus divites, fastidiosus divites, fastidiosus divites, dimittens in hanes, in hanes, in anes. What does this solution mean for our tactus? Well, that we don't have a steady tactus that is kept throughout the triple and duple sections, and also that the beginning of the piece with the duple meter has a different tactus than the one after this triple meter section. Such examples can be found also in the music of Claudio Monteverdi and other early 17th century composers. Such solutions, and even other more refined ones, might be appropriate according to the different cases. We should remember that sometimes simple musical solutions, which feel natural and support the declamation of the text, were not possible to notate using the rather rigid notation system of the time. Does this mean that we should throw away all the proportions and just find solutions according to our opinion? Of course not. The proportions should be our starting point, and very often they will make musical sense. But we should also be ready for such special cases, and always look for something that will render the text in a clear way. Also, sometimes it seems that certain composers had their own system, and by looking at many of their pieces we can perhaps decode it. But one should not try to find a system that will always work. The musical reality, both in theory and in the actual music, was simply too rich and varied to allow it. When looking for the best solution, there are 2 things to be aware of. First, historical bar lines, when they do appear, are mostly inconsistent and are not a reliable tool for finding the right tactus. The second thing to be aware of are modern editions. Typically, the modern editor interprets and decides what kind of proportion should be taken, and does not supply sufficient tools to enable the performer to reconsider the interpretation. So make sure to check the originals if you can, hoping that it won't confuse you even more. So this was our show about tactus and proportions. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to check this special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. Feel free to comment, share and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.